I'm Matthew from Dark Ascent, and today I'm looking at how wearing a dress to climb K2 ended in a way nobody planned for. From getting separated after repeated pauses to managing a wedding dress in freezing wind and low visibility, to drifting off the main route after small interruptions while adjusting the dress through steep, technical terrain. It was July 23, 2016 on K2, the 28,251-foot peak rising in the Karakoram Range near the remote frontier between Pakistan-administered Gilgit-Baltistan and China's Xinjiang region, where steep glacial walls and unstable weather systems dominate the upper mountain. Janessa Srien was 31 years old and based in Boulder, Colorado, working as a freelance outdoor photographer, funded through brand partnerships, travel publications, and a growing online audience built around expedition storytelling. She had experience on technical peaks above 18,000 feet, but this was her first attempt on an 8,000-meter summit. In the months before the climb, Janessa developed a summit concept focused on contrast photography, including a white dress image against K2's dark rock and snow. As interest grew, expedition logistics shifted toward supporting filming, with extra camera gear and summit timing tied more closely to media conditions. The team ascended the Abruzzi Spur, a highly exposed route above 26,000 feet where weather, congestion, and narrow margins for error shape every decision. You can tell when gear starts serving the camera more than the climb itself. During acclimatization, progress was generally within expected limits, but guides noted slower recovery and more frequent filming stops. Between Camp 2 and Camp 3, repeated content pauses increased time spent stationary in sub-zero shade, while frequent glove removal for camera use slowed hand recovery and intensified cold exposure effects. By Camp 4, right near the death zone, the forecast was already tightening up, with winds picking up earlier than expected. Even so, the team still went for the summit during one of the busiest climbing windows. By the time everyone funneled into the bottleneck and the traverse, it wasn't really moving anymore. Just long waits on fixed lines, people standing still in brutal wind and cold, hoping the line ahead would finally clear. During a prolonged congestion period, she paused for a brief, filmed segment tied to the summit narrative. Although short in intent, the stop occurred at peak traffic, leaving her stationary on the rope system for an extended interval in temperatures between -15 degrees Fahrenheit and -25 degrees Fahrenheit, with sustained wind chill. After resuming movement, climbers noted early cold impairment, including reduced dexterity, slower hardware handling, and diminished responsiveness during rope transitions. Everyone around just waits in silence during those bottlenecks. On the descent below the summit traverse, her pace became increasingly uneven. She showed worsening cold stress, slower clipping and unclipping, reduced grip strength, and difficulty maintaining footing on wind-scoured ice. These effects, initially subtle, intensified as exertion rose and oxygen demand increased. Conditions deteriorated further below the bottleneck traverse as visibility dropped, and wind strengthened, with refreezing terrain making movement more technical. She fell behind her climbing partners during an oxygen exchange near a fixed anchor, where delays increased exposure in the death zone. From there, the situation shifted from isolated delay to progressive impairment. Extended static exposure and hypoxia reduced peripheral circulation and fine motor control. Climbers later described difficulty with basic rope tasks, often requiring repeated attempts to clip and adjust gear. As she continued downward, stops became longer and more frequent. Investigators later reconstructed a gradual shutdown consistent with severe hypothermia progression, starting with loss of dexterity, followed by slowed decision-making and reduced coordination, requiring repeated pauses to stabilize equipment between fixed sections. Eventually, she was no longer able to maintain continuous movement with the group. Separated by distance and worsening weather, she became stationary on exposed terrain below the traverse. In this phase, wind exposure, low oxygen saturation, and prior prolonged immobility combined to rapidly reduce functional warmth, particularly in the extremities. Her condition slowly turned into a prolonged hypothermic collapse where she could move less and less until she stopped moving at all. Nearby climbers couldn't safely reach her because of poor visibility, avalanche risk, and unstable conditions along the fixed-line corridor with heavy descent traffic. Her body was recovered during a brief weather window 2 days later below the bottleneck route. Recovery teams documented findings consistent with severe hypothermia following extended high-altitude exposure, along with cold-related tissue damage and minor injuries consistent with uncontrolled movement on steep terrain before death. The expedition review identified a convergence of contributing factors rather than a single point of failure: delayed timing during summit congestion, extended stationary exposure during filming intervals, high-altitude hypoxia, progressive loss of dexterity in extreme cold, and reduced capacity to safely manage descent systems once impairment began. The final assessment described a gradual, exposure-driven failure of function, unfolding during descent, rather than a single acute accident event. It was July 18, 2014 on K2, rising through the isolated Karakoram Mountains along the high-altitude boundary zone between northern Pakistan and western China, an area defined by long glacial valleys, shifting ice fields, and rapidly changing summit conditions. Rachel Comey was 29 years old and worked as a physical therapist in Portland, Oregon. She and her husband had built their climbing experience through the Pacific Northwest and the Andes, developing a steady, methodical progression into technical terrain. K2 represented a significant step beyond that range, where conditions above 26,000 feet leave little margin for error. Months before the expedition, her objective evolved into a personal documentary-style summit attempt, centered on carrying part of her wedding dress for summit photography, treating it as a symbolic anchor rather than standard gear. After early sponsorship support collapsed, the project became more self-directed and informally structured, with added emotional weight placed on completing the visual concept. Bringing something like that up there changes how every decision feels. Even small ones start getting tied to it. She joined a commercial expedition operating along the standard southeast ascent corridor, where multiple teams, fixed lines, and overlapping camps created congestion under unstable Karakoram summer conditions. During acclimatization, she experienced variable weather, including snowfall and wind loading. At Camp 3, she developed persistent cough, reduced appetite, and fragmented sleep, but continued filming despite incomplete recovery between rotations. At higher camps, guides started noticing she wasn't recovering as quickly and needed more help with basic tasks. Before the summit push, she reshuffled her gear and cut back on emergency insulation, just to make space for filming equipment and the wedding dress, which stayed easy to reach the whole way up. The summit push began overnight in deteriorating conditions. Congestion along fixed ropes led to prolonged static exposure in extreme cold, while several climbers turned back. Rachel continued upward with a smaller group after falling behind the main flow during repeated pauses to manage gear and reposition the dress within her pack system. Throughout the ascent, the dress became a recurring point of interruption. Brief stops to adjust its placement beneath outer layers or prevent snagging on harness components created small but repeated delays between rope transitions. These pauses accumulated into increased spacing from her rope partners, though no single moment was considered critical in isolation. She eventually reached the summit later in the rotation, under conditions already outside the initial weather window. Descent began immediately afterward in worsening visibility and increasing wind. As she moved down from the summit, additional pauses occurred to resecure and reposition the dress after it shifted under layered clothing during exertion. These brief stops, combined with fatigue and cold, gradually increased separation from her husband and the other climbers ahead of her during fixed-line transitions, where spacing was already fragile. Near the upper descent corridor, reduced visibility and fresh snowfall obscured markers and rope anchors. During one of these intervals, a hesitation to fully resecure her gear before continuing resulted in a further delay at a junction between established and secondary descent lines. That small spacing gap caused her to drift off the main tracked corridor into a less defined route below overlapping footprints. In whiteout conditions, everything starts to look like it might be the right way, even when it isn't. As conditions got worse, she kept following what looked like the main line without realizing she had drifted off it. The ground slowly changed into a soft, snow-covered slope above a hidden field of crevasses, with a buried snow bridge stretching over a void underneath the fresh snow. When she stepped onto the concealed bridge, the structure collapsed under load, sending her into a deep, crevasse system below the descent path. Investigators later concluded that the snow bridge showed no visible surface indicators at the time of travel due to recent snowfall and wind redistribution. Search operations began once weather conditions improved, but access, delays, and unstable snowpack slowed ground response. Her body was later recovered approximately 80 feet below the entry point during a brief recovery window supported by aerial reconnaissance. The expedition review identified contributing factors, including fatigue during descent, deteriorating weather, separation from the main rope group during repeated gear management pauses, and navigation drift in near whiteout conditions. The final assessment emphasized that the critical failure point was not a single technical error, but a hesitation-driven delay pattern linked to repeated interruptions while managing personal gear, which ultimately led to loss of spacing, route deviation, and entry onto unstable terrain. It was July 27, 2018 on K2, deep within the Karakoram Range along the rugged borderlands between Pakistan and China, where the upper slopes transition into the death zone and weather patterns collapse into sudden wind and whiteout cycles. Lauren Hayes was 34 years old and based in Scottsdale, Arizona, working as a fitness instructor and online wellness coach. Her public identity centered on endurance performance and measurable physical discipline, reinforced through documented ascents of Kilimanjaro, Aconcagua, and Island Peak. Each climb expanded her audience and increased expectations for the next objective, with K2 positioned as a defining summit. Months before the expedition, she entered sponsorship agreements tied directly to summit-based content delivery. The climb was partially financed through media obligations requiring imagery from the upper mountain, effectively linking summit timing to contractual output. For this purpose, she carried a lightweight, athletic-style dress intended for summit photography, introduced publicly as part of the expedition narrative. That expectation followed her into every logistical and pacing decision on the mountain. When something is tied to the goal like that, it doesn't feel optional anymore. Her prior experience remained limited to guided non-technical and moderate high-altitude climbs, leaving a significant gap compared to sustained technical exposure above 26,000 feet on K2. The expedition moved through the early rotations without anything major going wrong, but things started getting tougher above Camp 2. Lauren began dealing with constant headaches, nausea, and a kind of ongoing fatigue that just didn't really go away between climbs. It was picked up during routine checks, but she kept filming anyway, often pulling off her gloves and face protection in freezing wind just to work the camera, which meant more time exposed while already running on limited oxygen. At Camp 4 near 26,000 feet, she reported poor sleep and limited recovery prior to the summit push. A minor equipment correction involving crampon security was addressed the night before departure, but not escalated. The summit rotation began overnight under heavy traffic as multiple teams converged on a narrow weather window, creating congestion along the bottleneck and traverse with prolonged static exposure in extreme cold. As delays accumulated, oxygen consumption rose beyond planned limits. At this altitude, oxygen functions as a critical physiological support, and depletion directly affects cognition and motor control. Her pace became irregular, with slower transitions and intermittent hesitation at anchor points that normally require near automatic execution. Despite these signs, she continued beyond the safe turnaround window driven by the summit schedule embedded in the expedition's contractual expectations. During descent, worsening wind and limited visibility reduced contrast across the fixed rope system. Snow accumulation obscured anchors, and softened terrain definition between sections. Climbing partners later reported prolonged pauses at transitions, where she appeared disoriented and required repeated attempts to re-establish connections between anchors. Investigators later identified probable high-altitude cerebral edema combined with oxygen depletion as key drivers of cognitive breakdown. Decision-making deteriorated under sustained hypoxia, shifting from procedural climbing behavior to impaired sequencing of simple actions. Near a steep section above Camp Fear, she mismanaged a transition between fixed anchors and drifted off the established rope line during a brief sequencing error. From that point, instead of a single fall event, she moved into progressively worsening disorientation in near whiteout conditions. Separated from the main fixed corridor, she continued into terrain with no clear route markers, where overlapping tracks and fresh snowfall eliminated reliable navigation cues. In this environment, small errors in direction compounded rapidly, leading to full loss of route awareness. Whiteout doesn't feel dramatic while you're in it. It just turns everything the same color, and you're guessing if the ground is still there underneath you. As conditions deteriorated further, she was unable to reorient to the fixed line system. Exposure to wind, altitude, and oxygen deprivation led to complete functional collapse in place, rather than a recoverable descent error. Search efforts later confirmed she remained in upper terrain outside the main corridor until conditions allowed recovery access. Her body was found after a weather window opened up, and what they saw pointed to long exposure in extreme cold and altitude-related brain effects that likely led to confusion, loss of coordinations, and getting off the intended route. The expedition review identified severe fatigue, oxygen depletion, and probable high-altitude cerebral edema as primary contributors. It also noted that contractual summit timing pressures, combined with extended filming obligations and oxygen-dependent pacing constraints, contributed to the decision threshold being exceeded, shifting the incident from a controlled descent to a progressive cognitive failure in extreme conditions, rather than a single isolated accident event. It was August 2nd, 2015 on K2, rising in the central Karakoram system near the frontier between Pakistan and China, an environment shaped by towering ice seracs, narrow ascent corridors, and long exposed ridgelines above 26,000 feet. Nicole Ambon was 27 years old and worked as a wedding planner in Denver, Colorado. Known for structure and precision in her professional life, she approached the expedition with the same planning mindset, where outcomes were expected to follow preparation. K2, however, operated outside that logic, where environmental limits override scheduling and control. In the months before the climb, she set a personal goal tied to reaching the summit before turning 30, framing the ascent as a symbolic transition point. The idea of a summit photograph became part of that milestone narrative, adding personal meaning to the objective beyond the climb itself. She had limited high-altitude experience above 20,000 feet, enough to understand early acclimatization effects, but not the sustained decline typical above 8,000 meters. She joined a lower-cost guiding operation on the Abruzzi Spur, where logistical margins were thinner and timing flexibility more constrained than on larger commercial expeditions. A small public fundraising effort also tied external attention to her success, reinforcing the sense of a defined outcome. Acclimatization progressed unevenly. She required slower rotations and additional recovery time, and by Camp 3 showed swelling in extremities and persistent fatigue beyond expected levels. Guides noted the symptoms but continued the schedule due to a narrowing weather window and the need to commit to a summit attempt while conditions briefly stabilized. Before the summit push, she carried a lightweight white dress and camera equipment intended for summit documentation. To accommodate this, she reduced backup provisions and redundancy in her load, slightly narrowing her physiological and safety buffer in an environment where margins are already minimal. It always looks like a small trade-off when you're packing. Nobody really feels the consequence of it yet at that point. The summit rotation began under deteriorating conditions. Above 26,000 feet, her movement slowed, and fixed-line progress required frequent pauses and assistance. Despite this, she continued upward and reached the summit late in the operating window, entering descent as weather and visibility began to decline. Instead of turning back right away, she stopped for a short moment near the summit to take it in and get a quick shot tied to the goal she'd been aiming for. That delay pushed her onto a later descent schedule, putting her into the afternoon hours when the snow higher up tends to get less stable. Descent toward the bottleneck occurred as conditions shifted into warmer afternoon instability. The traverse below the hanging glacier funnels climbers into a narrow corridor beneath exposed serac walls where even small timing delays increase exposure to overhead hazard. As she moved below the summit zone, her descent became slower and more intermittent, with longer pauses on steep sections before resuming with assistance from fixed lines. Fatigue and altitude-related impairment became more visible, and spacing between her and the main group gradually widened during transitions between anchors, reducing collective movement control in the corridor. It's like everything just gets erased in one stretch of movement. While multiple teams were descending through the same constrained passage, a section of overhead ice and accumulated snow released from above the traverse. The collapse expanded quickly into an avalanche flow that crossed the fixed ropes, striking climbers on the route and overwhelming the narrow channel beneath the bottleneck. Nicole was swept from the slope and carried downslope within the moving snow and debris field, disappearing from view below the traverse as the flow continued across uneven terrain. Immediate rescue was not possible due to continuing instability in the release zone, reduced visibility, and the risk of secondary slides in the same corridor. Search operations were delayed until conditions stabilized several days later. Her body was recovered below the traverse in a deposition zone consistent with avalanche transport and burial under mixed snow and ice debris. The expedition review identified contributing factors including late descent timing into an afternoon instability window, accumulated fatigue from extended summit rotations, congestion along the fixed line corridor, and the environmental transition zone beneath serac structures. The final assessment pointed to timing on the descent. A short stop during a summit moment pushed her into unstable afternoon conditions where she was caught in fast-moving snow and ice rather than a single mistake. It was July 29th, 2013, on K2, the second highest mountain on Earth, standing within the Karakoram Range in the far northern reaches of the region bordering Pakistan and China, where deep avalanche-prone valleys feed into one of the most technically demanding high-altitude environments in the world. Lysa Hesco was 36 years old and based in Seattle, Washington, working as a videographer specializing in outdoor wedding films and remote elopement documentation. Her career had gradually expanded from accessible wilderness filming into high-altitude alpine environments, with K2 representing the furthest extension of that progression. She had prior experience on Denali and Cho Oyu, but limited exposure to sustained technical climbing at extreme altitude. The expedition was structured as a documentary project that initially included a lightweight dress concept tied to pre-expedition promotional material and sponsorship expectations for summit imagery. Early into the climb, she ended up dropping the dress before the higher camps once it became clear it just wasn't practical in those conditions. It did lighten her load, but it also left her with this lingering mental pressure, like the story she'd built around the summit didn't quite match what was actually happening on the mountain anymore. She joined a commercial expedition using shared fixed-line infrastructure across the upper route, where multiple teams converged during narrow weather windows, creating congestion in key technical sections of the ascent. Things quickly stacked up here. Too many people, too little space. From early rotations, she carried filming equipment alongside standard climbing gear, increasing fatigue and slowing recovery between camps. As altitude increased, cold exposure and oxygen limitation began compounding normal exertion, reducing efficiency during repeated climbs and descents between camps. At higher elevations near the start of the death zone, extended exposure during congested fixed-line sections led to prolonged stationary periods in extreme cold. Without the added insulation buffer originally planned for the summit concept, she relied entirely on standard expedition layering, which became increasingly marginal under wind and static exposure conditions. By the summit rotation, weather conditions deteriorated beyond forecast expectations. Wind speeds increased and temperatures dropped further during the summit window, while congestion along fixed ropes forced repeated stops in exposed positions. These pauses increased total time spent immobile, limiting the body's ability to maintain core temperature. During descent, her pace became progressively more conservative. The earlier decision to abandon the dress removed a physical hazard, but did not resolve the psychological tension tied to the summit narrative. Climbers later noted she adopted a cautious, delayed rhythm at anchor transitions, prioritizing stability over group pace. This conservative pacing gradually separated her from faster-moving teams on the fixed lines. Sometimes slowing down feels safer, even when it quietly puts distance between people. As separation increased, she entered sections of the route alone, or with reduced visual contact with other climbers. Intermittent weather changes reduced visibility and erased clear reference points along the rope corridor. When conditions briefly worsened, she stopped at a fixed anchor to wait for regrouping that never fully reformed. That stop ended up dragging on as the wind picked up and the temperature kept dropping. With no safe way to move alone and already struggling to stay warm after sitting still for so long, she stayed put through the night as conditions got worse. With limited movement, repeated glove exposure during minor gear adjustments, and reduced caloric and thermal recovery capacity at altitude, her ability to rewarm declined steadily. The psychological hesitancy that had begun earlier in descent translated into delayed decision-making, keeping her stationary rather than committing to risky movement in low visibility. By morning, she was no longer responsive to changing conditions along the route. Recovery was only possible during a later weather window when teams regained access to the section. She was found in a stationary position along the descent line, consistent with prolonged exposure rather than a single traumatic event. The expedition review identified a sequence of contributing factors: abandonment of the dress early in the climb, removing a physical hazard but leaving an unresolved psychological anchor in her decision-making, conservative pacing during descent leading to gradual separation from the group, and eventual forced isolation during worsening weather. The final assessment concluded that the fatal outcome resulted from cumulative exposure and stationary overnight hypothermia, where the primary mechanism was not a discrete accident, but a progressive inability to transition from caution into movement in a collapsing weather window.